sunshine as one of the 8 pillars of health. Um, Getting out into the sun is really important, especially for those who live at higher latitudes and are further away from the equator. As we'll show here, the components of getting sun exposure are very beneficial to our health. And today we're going to highlight a recent randomized controlled trial that showed to benefit those, in this case with COVID-19, who were exposed to near infrared radiation. Let's get started. So for those of you who are interested in learning more about this, you'll see that the sun is actually really important, especially now that the sun is low in the sky. As we're recording this, it's in the month of January, and this is when you have the lowest amounts of sunlight. And interestingly, people actually got a lot of problems this time of year, like depression. Some of you may know that seasonal affective disorder, which is the name that we give that kind of depression, is actually more prevalent, especially in parts of the planet where they don't get enough sunshine. So here we see a nice winter road and that sun coming up. Yes, even in the wintertime, you can get enough sunlight for what it is that you need to do. Okay, so today we're going to look at a study that was done, and it was published in the Journal of Photochemistry and Photobiology, and the title of this study was Cardiopulmonary and Hematological Effects of Infrared LED Photobiomodulation in the Treatment of SARS-CoV-2. So what they did is they took 30 patients that were in the hospital for COVID and they made them wear this vest or this jacket. And what you can see here on the left are basically LED lights, light emitting diodes, basically that emitted invisible light in the range of infrared. So infrared is a type of light that is emitted that you cannot see. You can't see it with the naked eye. And they basically put these LEDs here on the chest, as you can see. Now let's get a little bit more detail for those of you who want a little bit more information. 300 different LEDs, about 2/100 of a watt. Each total watt was 6 watts. Pretty small in terms of energy. And as you can see here, we see in the visible spectrum. So the visible spectrum is a very specific aspect of light. And specifically, it's this portion right here that's visible. So the portion we're talking about is outside of the visible spectrum, and that's what the sun can actually give off. And it does so here, as you can see. Here's the distribution of the wavelengths that the sun gives off. These here are the longer wavelengths that we cannot see. These here are the shorter wavelengths that we cannot see. We can only see this area of the sunlight. But as you can see, most of the sunlight is in the form of infrared radiation. And then specifically, this was given off right here at 940 nanometers. That was the wavelength. And that's important to understand because unlike light, which hits your eyes and you can see it, this type of light, in fact, long wavelengths in this area, so this is 940, can actually penetrate really deep inside of the body. So this light that's coming from the sun, outside of what you can see, actually penetrates and goes through your clothes, it goes through your skin, and it goes down into the subcutaneous layer and even further than that. In fact, there's some data that says it could even go as deep as about 8 centimeters, which is pretty impressive. So, and those who have melanin-rich skin and those who are melanin deficient, you can see that there is still a considerable amount of scattering, although there seems to be a little bit more scattering in those that are melanin deficient. But it can happen in both situations. And that's important because if this black line here represents the total number of cells in your body, this red line here, as you go from 0 years old up to 80, you can see here that there's quite a majority of the cells of your human body that are responsive to NIR or near infrared radiation, which is what we're talking about. So again, if we think about what they did, they put this vest on people and they exposed them to that bright light. They took these 30 inpatients that had COVID-19, and that's where they can't breathe, they can't take a breath in, their oxygen levels are low. And for 7 days, they did this for 15 minutes a day. They put this jacket on them at 940 nanometers, and they wanted to see how that would help. And pretty interestingly here, when they looked at the two groups, Group 1 was known as LED. Group 2 was known as the control group. They were pretty similar in terms of body mass index, in terms of age. There was a little bit more severity of COVID-19 in the intervention group, but they were pretty much the same in terms of men and women. And also, all of these comorbidities were pretty much the same. So good randomization at the beginning. At the end of this, though, notice what happened. Look at the oxygen saturation improvement. In the control group, they only went up by 2.6 percentage points. But the intervention group, who got the near-infrared radiation, went up 9.4 percentage points. And all the way down the line, whether it was the amount of air they could breathe in or how forcibly they could breathe in, what happened to their heart rate and their blood pressure, all of it was improved in those that got near-infrared radiation. In terms of their blood counts, the biggest ones to look at here is the leukocytes, which dropped significantly, which is good. That means that the infection was getting better. But also the lymphocytes got much better, and that's a sign that the viral infection improved. So in their conclusions, they found that that LED light enhanced the effect of conventional therapy. They actually got out of the hospital 4 days faster when they got sunlight or near-infrared radiation from these LEDs. And there was significant improvement in the ability of the neutrophils and the lymphocytes to normalize. Pulmonary function tests improved as well, and all around these patients seemed to do better when they were exposed to light. So really important to notice that. It's really quite something, actually. There was no reported side effects. This was easy. It was low cost. The pulmonary function that they did on the patients were very robust. They used this vest, as I mentioned, at 940 nanometers of light, which is one of the components of sunlight. And these patients improved actually pretty significantly. They said the main limitation of the present study was the size. They used 30 patients. But even despite the fact that they only used 30, these findings were statistically significant. So we actually talked about this on our MedCram channel about why it might be that light from the sun may actually benefit you and how it would benefit, especially in COVID-19. And it has to do with something called oxidative stress. So oxidative stress is something that is related to diabetes. It's something that is related to high blood pressure, cholesterol, cardiovascular disease, stroke, in that in patients who have all of these diseases, their oxidative stress is worse. And the way to reduce oxidative stress is to take antioxidants. We see antioxidants in food. We see antioxidants in medications as well, but primarily in food, especially foods that end in berries. So boysenberry, blackberry, blueberries, things of that nature. And that's because of some chemical reactions that occur in the body. And I'll show you here just briefly. There is something in your body known as angiotensin II, and it's a pro-oxidant. Well, sometimes it's important to have a pro-oxidant, especially if your body's under stress and you need that, then that's something that's good. But you also need antioxidants that can balance that out. One of the major enzymes in your body that balances that out is something called ACE2. Unfortunately, ACE2 is also the receptor for the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and so it can knock it out. But suffice to know that angiotensin II, which is a pro-oxidant, is going to increase the amount of reactive oxygen species. But angiotensin 1,7, which is an antioxidant, is going to put the brakes on reactive oxygen species. So this is a balance that happens in the body. Angiotensin 2 is balanced out with angiotensin 1,7. And in a lot of people who are sick and have diabetes and hypertension, angiotensin 2, this one over here, is winning the battle. And angiotensin 1,7 over here on this side is needing help. Well, the problem comes in where you basically get infected with SARS-CoV-2. And when that happens, you knock out this ACE2, which is balancing things out. And when that happens, you get a lot of oxidative stress, more than the body can perhaps handle. Of course, the white blood cells that are attracted to the area of infection is also going to increase reactive oxygen species. And those reactive oxygen species will eventually damage the cells, especially the cells that are lining your blood vessels, and cause the release of factors that will cause blood clots, and those blood clots will eventually lead to hypoxemia. So what is the way that we have of mitigating against reactive oxygen species? Well, one of those things we've known this for a while, is getting good sleep at night is really important, because sleep leads to melatonin production, especially if we're not exposing our eyes to bright light. Well, what we're starting to see is that melatonin can also be produced, potentially, according to the hypothesis, from near-infrared radiation from, guess what? The sun. So in other words, we have a way of putting the brakes on reactive oxygen species at night by sleeping, and we have a way of putting the brakes on reactive oxygen species by day by getting outside and getting this natural light of near-infrared radiation. It seems as though in this randomized controlled trial that we just went over, if you're able to give artificially NIR to the patient, that can also show some benefits as well. So we have evidence that shows that people with COVID-19 actually have a worsening of reactive oxygen species. And let's go over that data real quick. This is a study that was published back in December of 2021. And it showed here that across all years, whether it's in the young group, the middle group, or the older group, that those with COVID have reduced levels of antioxidants. Okay? So we know that. We also know that across the young, intermediate, and older population, that COVID patients have higher levels of oxidative stress. And we also know that across the young, intermediate, and older age groups, that those with COVID have higher levels of oxidative damage. And that oxidative damage can be very important, especially when it comes to hypoxemia. Here we have a blood vessel that blood is flowing through, and it's lined on both sides with these endothelial cells, and in there are these little green things called von Willebrand's factor, and von Willebrand's factor should not normally be in circulation. They should be trapped, kept away, unless there's damage to the endothelial cells. So what happens when COVID-19 comes in and it causes oxidative stress in these cells start to die, and when they start to die, these von Willebrand's factors come out and go into circulation, and then what happens is they cause blood clots, and these blood clots grow, and they finally block the blood vessel, and if this is in the lung, you're not going to get adequate oxygenation. So you can see here clearly that it would be beneficial, and you can see why, that near-infrared radiation either from the sun or from the LED lights in that jacket that we talked about would cause somebody to prevent clots because of a potential intermediary called melatonin. So melatonin is pretty important. And we actually talked about that as well with these von Willebrand's factors on a lecture that we gave on May 6th back in 2020, how they come out and they actually can cause blood clots. So in actuality, you can see here that the sun can cause near-infrared radiation, which would block reactive oxygen species. But what we found here in this study is that not only that can happen, but you can also get the vest, as in this case, so they did in Brazil in this randomized controlled trial, to get the same sort of benefit as well. Okay, so because what we saw in this randomized controlled trial is that the vest actually shut down hypoxemia. These patients got better and were out of the hospital, this is amazing, 4 days earlier. If you think about that, medications like Tamiflu reduces the symptoms of the flu by just 24 hours. This did it by 96 hours, which is just phenomenal. And by the way, there is data that I have seen that patients who are in a room, let's say there's 2 patients in a room, that the one closest to the window is typically discharged more quickly. So I think there is something definitely to say for the sun. And speaking of the sun, let's take a look again at that solar radiation spectrum. So again, we have the visible light, And we have the ultraviolet light, we have the infrared light, and that is coming right in here. And we believe that this is the area here that is very important in the preceding reactions that we've talked about. Now that's important to understand because there is something else that can actually give you near infrared radiation even more than the sun by itself, and that is living in and around green things, because the green leaves and the green grass, as you can see here, this is just from the sun. What happens when you have reflectivity from green leaves and grass? There's actually a dramatic increase in near infrared radiation. So this beneficial near infrared radiation that we're seeing can be enhanced if somebody is and around and is outside green spaces. So that's a really interesting aspect, because a lot of health experts will say that you need to get outside and into green spaces. We're seeing a benefit when people get outside into green spaces. And just to give you a little bit of more information there, this is a near infrared photograph. So this is a photograph taken in the near infrared spectrum, and it's enhancing that near infrared light by making it white. And you can see here that the trees are just shining and the grass is just shining. So again, it really helps when you get outside, especially into green spaces. Here is another photograph looking at Central Park. You can see the buildings are pretty cold in terms of reflectivity. They're blue, but the trees are just lighting up really brightly. So if we were to compare the jacket with the sun, you would see here that the jacket is concentrated at one wavelength, which is 940. Whereas the sun is concentrated, 53% of it anyway, in this near infrared or infrared spectrum. And you're actually getting about 25 times more power in that kind of an area. So it really makes you wonder, if the sun is so powerfully good for your health, wouldn't it make sense that we would notice that perhaps in the wintertime that the lack of sun would cause more illnesses? And that's exactly what we see, isn't it? I mean, in December, in January, November, when's flu season? Flu season is always in the wintertime. We know that. We have some more information, though. We can look at this scientific report. This was published in Nature, which is a pretty prestigious journal. And it showed, asked the question well, what is it that contributes to COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2? And so they looked at the countries of Europe in the autumn of 2020 and asked, what was the thing that determined when the first surge was in their country, or the inflation date as they called it. So they mapped out when the inflation date was, okay, and they put it according to a number of different variables. One was temperature, the other one was humidity, and the last one was latitude. Latitude is basically a way of saying sunlight, okay, or lack of sunlight, going from least to most, okay? And what did they find? They found absolutely no correlation between temperature and the inflation date, or when the country first noticed its surge. They found no correlation between humidity and when they first found the surge. It was a flat line. But notice here that Finland, which is the highest northern country in Europe, was the first one to experience the inflation date way back in September. And Greece, which is way at the bottom, was the last one to experience the inflation date, which was in October 19. Okay? Notice, let's take a look at those maps. Here is Finland up here, and here is Greece down here. And then all of the other countries are in between. And they line up perfectly, as you can see here, in this graph. So this is data that is very suggestive that sunlight is actually very important in this factor. There's another study that was done. This one was published back in April of 2021, and it looked at latitude and not the incidence of inflation, but the deaths associated with COVID-19, not just in the United States, but also in England and also in Italy. And let's take a look at this here. So the first thing that they wanted to do is they wanted to make sure that vitamin D was not playing a role in this at all. So they took out of the equation all of the areas of the United States in the wintertime that could give you enough vitamin D to make a difference. So they eliminated all of that and they looked at the rest. And what they found was really interesting. Here they actually tied it to ultraviolet A radiation, but really it could be any kind of radiation from the sun. And what they found was that when they looked at the COVID-19 deaths per million, okay, they found that there were higher deaths per million when they got the least amount of sunlight from the sun. And that when they got more sunlight from the sun, the COVID-19 death rates actually went down pretty significantly. They then looked at England and they tried to predict, and guess what they found? The same sort of thing happened. Here we have COVID-19 deaths per million, and notice that it went down with increasing amounts of sunshine. In Italy, the same thing. It went down with increasing amounts of radiation. And that caused the authors of this study to say the following. They said, in conclusion, this study is observational, and therefore any causal interpretation needs to be taken with caution. However, if the relationship identified proves to be causal, it suggests that optimizing sun exposure may be a possible public health intervention. Given that the effects appears independent of a vitamin D pathway, it suggests possible new COVID-19 therapies. Now, I had the opportunity to collaborate with Margaret Skutch. She is a professor of geography at the university in Mexico. And we looked geographically across the planet to see whether or not there was a correlation between where you lived on the planet and the COVID-19 death rates. And it's a little complicated because you have countries like Chile, which are very long, and they span a number of different latitudes. And also there are different countries with different BMIs. But basically what we found is that in countries that had a high BMI, okay, that there was a correlation between death rates and latitude, that higher latitude equaled higher mortality. And we actually published this paper in a peer-reviewed journal, and it was titled The Geographical Approach to the Development of Hypotheses Related to COVID-19 Death Rates. So you're thinking, wow, this is amazing. We had no idea that exposure to light would have such a huge impact on our well-being. Let me give you another study, by the way, that I just had pop into my head. There was a study that was done in Oxford and also in Leiden, the Netherlands. So Oxford, England, and Leiden, the Netherlands. And what they did was very simple. They simply drew blood on a number of patients. I think it was somewhere close to 7,000, or it could have been even more than that. And they looked at the weather reports in those two cities where these people lived, and they asked the question, how many of the last 7 days was there adequate sunshine? And they could look up at the weather report based on whenever these people went in to get their blood drawn. They would just look at the previous 7 days, and they would quantify how much sun there was in those previous 7 days. And then they marched it out, put it through a computer, and they found, lo and behold, that in general, on average, the people that drew blood after 7 days of more sunlight had better, on average, better indices for insulin sensitivity and for triglyceride levels. And this went across the board. In just 7 days, if you're getting enough sunshine, you can actually get improved cardiovascular and metabolic outcomes. So if you want to go in and get a blood test, my recommendation is to get as much sun as you can in the previous 7 days. That way you're going to get the best tests possible. But folks, this has been around for some period of time. This is not news. Let me show you here what some formidable and well-known people have said about sunshine and light prior to even this century. Let's look at John Harvey Kellogg. He wrote this in Light Therapeutics, a practical manual of phototherapy for the student and the practitioner. This was published by the Good Health Publishing Company in Battle Creek, Michigan. And this is what John Harvey Kellogg said. He said, heliotherapy, or the use of sunlight as a curative means, is one of the oldest of natural healing agents. It is only within the last 20 years, however, that the physiological and therapeutic effects of light derived from natural and artificial sources have been made the subject of careful scientific study. Within this period, numerous investigators have devoted themselves to the study of the subject, and the extended researches that have been made and have resulted in the development of a new class of therapeutic methods, principles, and measures which constitute the science of phototherapy. There was another formidable, well-known physician who was the medical director of the New England Sanitarium in Boston, Massachusetts, a gentleman by the name of Wells A. Rubel, who went on to become the first president of the College of Medical Evangelists, which is now known as Loma Linda University in Loma Linda, California. Back in 1918, during the pandemic, he said the following, as was printed in the periodical Life and Health, May 1st, 1919. He said, "The present epidemic of influenza has furnished excellent opportunity to test out the efficacy of rational treatment in dealing with respiratory disorders, especially in conditions accompanying and following attacks of influenza." So he basically would apply sunshine and hydrotherapy to his patients in the sanitarium, and indeed in 10 sanitariums in the Northeast. And what he found in comparison to the Army hospitals is that when they started this treatment relatively early, that the progression to pneumonia in his patients only had a rate of about 2%, whereas in the Army hospitals, it was 16%. This is where a lot of his benefit came early on, and because of that, the infection fatality ratio in those sanitariums was only 1.1%, whereas the infection fatality ratio in the Army hospitals was almost 6 times that. And so, folks, this has been well known. This is not a secret. There have been many, many healthcare institutions and hospitals which have looked at this and have used heliotherapy as a bedrock or a cornerstone of therapy and treatment. Ellen G. White, who was a health reformer in the 1800s, wrote this: "The feeble ones should press out into the sunshine as earnestly and naturally as do the shaded plants and vines. The pale and sickly grain blade that has struggled up out of the cold of early spring puts out the natural and healthy deep green after enjoying for a few days the health and life-giving rays of the sun. Go out into the light and warmth of the glorious sun, you pale and sickly ones, and share with vegetation its life-giving, health-dealing power." That's the health reformer, May 1st, 1871. And she also says, interestingly, as we talked about melatonin, not only coming from the sun in the day, but coming from the pineal gland at night, only if you're not exposing your eyes to bright light. We know that now as scientists here in the 21st century. Well, she said this back in 1888 in a letter published to her secretary. She said, "Make it a habit not to sit up after 9 o'clock. Every light should be extinguished. This turning night into day is a wretched, health-destroying habit." And she knew this very, very well. And folks, since her time, as you can see here in the red bar, near-infrared radiation has been decreasing in our lives for many different reasons, for 3 reasons. The first reason is that we're only spending about 7% of our life outdoors, whereas in the past we spent much, much more. The other reason is that we're using glass in our homes that block out near infrared, because that's the type of radiation that heats up the inside of your home and causes you to use more air conditioning. Also, we are using LED lights in our home that don't have any near infrared light as well. As you can see in this graph, here we have the sun, which with its wide spectrum. Here we have a LED light, which is only in the visible spectrum. And here we have a incandescent light here. This is that blue line, which is the type of bulbs that we used to use many years ago that gave us infrared light. As I mentioned before, the glass that we have here, we have the infrared spectrum right here. And we can see clear glass allows a lot of near infrared light, but then we have high, moderate, and low solar gain, low E glass, and you can see that with each of these types of glass, there is less and less infrared light that is able to be passed through. So in conclusion, what I would recommend is we need to get outside and obtain as much sunlight as possible, especially during the winter months. Now, you don't need to be in direct sunlight. You can be outside and still get plenty of near infrared light, especially if you happen to be around green areas. but I know that some of you may not be because of where you are in the winter, in the season. The other thing I would say is that near infrared radiation can penetrate through clothes. It can penetrate through sunscreen if you happen to be putting it on. And so just be aware that you don't have to have sunlight directly exposed. If you're a sickly person, this would be even more important, especially now in the wintertime, to get outside. I think we need to do more randomized controlled trials to understand this a little bit more. And I think, as a call out to healthcare professionals, I think what we need to be doing is getting patients who are in the hospital and getting them exposed more to natural light, more to the sun, especially getting them outside if the windows are blocking out that beneficial near infrared radiation. So I hope this has been beneficial and helpful. We need you to get outside and get into nature, maybe do some exercise, get a breath of fresh air. I think that's actually really important. So thank you for joining us, especially today on True Health.